Hey everyone, David Aragona and Craig Milkowski here, taking a look at one of the stakes events at Keeneland on Saturday. This one is race 8. It is the Grade 2 Shakertown, going the 5.5 furlong distance on the turf course. The race right before their feature on Saturday, the Grade 1 Bluegrass. And Craig, large field signed on here, 12 runners with one also eligible. The headliner, though, is obviously the number 8 Caravel. She's 8-5 on the morning line, female running against the males once again, but she certainly had success in that situation last year in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint when she was the upset winner of that race at 42-1.
Yeah, she surprised, but she proved she belonged, and it's not like she hadn't won many races in the past. She's a good filly. She's one who has always usually seems to show up, and I look forward to this race. For me, this always kind of kicks off the turf sprint season. I know we've had a few stakes earlier in the year at some different tracks, but this always seems to draw the better horses and kind of the start of the really good graded races in this division.
Over the past few years, Wesley Ward has started some good runners in this race, including horses like Golden Pal and Bound for Nowhere. This year, he has the number 12, Arrest Me Red, who is the slight second choice on the morning line over the number 3, Artemis City Limits. Also horses coming out of that Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint from last year. So we'll talk about that more in just a little bit. But before we get to the main contenders, let's take a look at the Timeform US pace projector for this race. Pace always important in these turf sprints. And Craig, I know the threshold is pretty high for a fast-paced flag to get triggered in a race like this, so I'm not surprised to not see any characterization of this pace, but it does feel like there are a few horses that want to be forwardly placed in this race, runners like the number 5, Mr. The number 8, Caravel, and of course, Artemis City Limits from the inside, but it's not a pace situation where I see multiple horses that necessarily need the lead to have their best chance.
Yeah, I think you pegged it right there. There's plenty of speed in the race, but all of these horses have shown some versatility. They're not horses that had to go to the lead in their biggest wins. Some of them can and have done it in the past, but they've also won from off the pace as well.
Let's also check out one of the new features in Timeform US, the Finish Projector. You could access the Finish Projector in both the new version of Timeform US on DRF mobile PPs and on DRF.com on desktop by just clicking on that Timeform US tab right next to DRF Classic PPs and Formulator. And Craig, this is a visual representation of the Timeform US Power Picks that people might be familiar with from the classic version of Timeform US, but it shows the relationships between the runners at the wire, and the number 12, whose name is escaping me now, Arrest Me Red, as I look at my notes. He is shown as the winner of this race over the number 8 Caravel. Both of those horses coming out of that Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint, and not a big surprise there, Craig. They're both two of the fastest horses on the way in terms of speed figures.
Yeah, these are largely based on speed figures. Caravel actually has run the faster speed figures, but it doesn't just look at 1 or 2 races. It looks at, I think it's the last 5, and Arrest Me Red's been a little more consistent. So when you put it together, gets a slight nod over Caravel.
Well, let's start to go through some of these contenders, and we'll begin with a replay of that Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint that many of these horses are coming out of, including the winner of this race, Caravel. And Craig, a lot went right for her this day. Her main pace rival, or the horse that people thought would be out winging on the front end, Golden Pal, failed to break from the gate alertly in this spot, which kind of left the early lead up for grabs, and Caravel broke alertly herself, so she was able to seize it and really seize the opportunity to win this race at a big price. Also in here, you see finishing behind her are Artemis City Limits and Arrest Me Red. Further up the track was Oceanic. But let's tackle Caravel first, Craig. Obviously, that's the best race that she's run in her career, that 42-1 upset last time. She's been a good horse for a long time. You don't win 12 of 20 starts in your career by accident, but most of her victories had not come quite at that class level. So I think here she's out to prove something, that she really belongs against these best turf sprinters in the country.
Yeah, she was 42-1 for a reason that day. She had been not winning at the highest level. She hadn't really competed well against males in the past, and she took that step forward. We see it kind of matched her best speed figure from 4 starts back, but I do think there's something to what you said, and she just got an ideal trip when Golden Pal didn't break that day. I think the horse inside of her, Emiratiana, was a little bit hesitant to go through, maybe could have challenged. I don't want to take too much away from her, but I do think you have to keep in mind that everything went right.
Yeah, just in general, Craig and I are not the type of handicappers that want to bet horses back that won at 42-1 in their last starts and could be a small fraction of that price in their next start. So maybe value not on the side of Caravel in this Shakertown. Another horse coming out of that Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint is the number 3 Artemis City Limits. He tried to contest the pace that day, was forwardly placed early, just faded a little bit at the end, but overall a respectable showing to be 5th against that international field. And Greg, I guess the one knock against him is that he doesn't always win that often. He did pair up those victories at Belmont and Saratoga earlier in the year, but throughout his career, he's sort of been the kind of horse that settles for minor awards a lot, but you can't knock his consistency. He always shows up with an honest effort.
He does, and you can see it in his speed figures. His lowest speed figure that we're showing actually came in a win, and I think that was largely because he was allowed to set an easy pace that day. But he's a real consistent horse, and as opposed to Caravel, who everything went right, everything didn't go right from him last time in that Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint. And it started at the post draw when he drew the far outside. Generally in one-turn races, I like the outside post, but that doesn't really hold water in these turf sprints when there's a quick run to the first turn. He was pressing that contested pace while wide out on the track. So I thought he ran very well and better than that 5th place finish would indicate.
I don't disagree. He's one of the horses to beat in this Shakertown. All the way on the outside is the number 12, Arrest Me Red. He was the horse that was showed as winning the race on that finish projector. Arguably, Craig, he was the one that was a little disappointing of those coming out of that Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint, finishing 8th that day. He was a big price in that race, going off at 20-1. Some other Wesley Ward runners in that race attracted more attention than he did. And maybe we just saw what his ceiling was that day. He's really never been among the best turf sprinters in the country, although he's competed well in a few top-level races. And he's another one, kind of like Artist City Limits, that is generally pretty consistent, shows up with good efforts. He will have to overcome an outside post position here, though.
Yeah, the one upside I'd say from him with that post is he is pretty versatile. We've seen him win on the lead. We've seen him win pressing the pace, and we've actually seen him coming to win from a little farther back than some others in here. His speed figures are consistent. I was personally disappointed. I did like him in that Breeders' Cup a little bit, and I didn't think he ran all that well. He kind of gave it up pretty early in the stretch. So I think he's going to run fine here. I don't want to hold that against him too much because it's the toughest turf sprint that we see in this country year in and year out. And in the end, he was only beaten 3 lengths. It'll just kind of depend on how much he gets bet, how interested I am in him.
From that outside post position, I wonder if the rider switch to Joao Rosario indicates a potential change in tactics compared to last time. He did run pretty well from off the pace 2 back at Kentucky Downs, so I would not be surprised to see him taken a little farther back in the early stages than he has been in some prior starts. The other horse coming out of that Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint that finished much farther back in the pack was the number 10 Oceanic. And Craig, this horse, maybe he didn't really belong in that spot. Just in general, he went off at nearly 50-1. He had run well 2 back in the prep for that, the Woodford Keeneland, where he closed well to be second behind the formidable Golden Pal, actually just edging out Artemis City Limits at the wire that day. And what I will say about his Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint performance was that his rider rode him like a 50-1 shot, just never really seemed invested in getting into the race or really motivating this horse at any point. So I'm just going to draw a line through that.
I don't blame you. And I don't want to make too much of the odds because there were a lot of big prices, as we already talked about, including the winner. But I would agree with you that the rider seemed disinterested. I'm glad to see a switch in rider for this mount. Maybe some of it had to do with the post position, and he just took him back hoping to make one big run. But he never made any run at all. So I'm with you. I'd put a line through that. And his other races actually make him competitive. We can see his speed figures are right there with what we saw from a Rest Me Red and some of what we've seen from Caravel when she doesn't deliver her A+ effort.
And with that rider switch, I won't be surprised if he shows a lot more early speed in this race. He's actually a horse that, for most of his career, was much more of a stalking, pace pressing type. But with the rider change at the end of last year, he kind of lost a lot of that speed. I wonder if we'll see him be more aggressive in this race. An intriguing new face in this division, Craig, is the number 5, Mr. Who is coming off a victory last time out at Fairgrounds that was pretty impressive. He was switching back to turf that day, but he's a horse who had had success on the turf early in his career, albeit running lower speed figures at that time. It's hard to know how he really stacks up against this field from a quality standpoint, but there's no knocking that performance last time. That 122 time form US speed figure seems legitimate.
It does seem legit. The one question is it comes over that Fairgrounds turf course, which has been a little iffy to say the least. It's a track which has favored horses making a wide sweeping move, which is something he was able to do. But I don't want to take too much away because of the track, because I think he's shown at this point that he favors turf. He's run all of his best races on turf, and that 122 speed figure sticks out quite a bit and is just as good as what all the others have run in here.
Yeah, he's the kind of horse that I'm intrigued to see how he does. I don't think I'd want to take any kind of short price on him coming off that career best number, but I'll be interested to see how he stacks up against this field. You could say a lot of the same things about the number 4, Baker's Bay. He's not coming off some flashy victory like Mr. is. I mean, his was a little bit more workmanlike last time when he won over the Tapeta surface at Turfway Park. But getting back to the turf, Craig, should be just fine for this horse. He did well on the turf early in his career, ran pretty well to be second to Bad Beat Brian a little bit later last year at Kentucky Downs. So we'll see how he does on the surface switch, but he does feel like one that's going to need some pace to develop up front.
He's definitely a horse that wants some pace. He's been running at Turfway, so maybe his turf form's a little dirtied up. We're going to see that with a couple of horses here. And I assume that's just mostly because of the calendar, keeping him in the Kentucky area. There's no turf racing. And now we have it at Keeneland. So if you think he can get back to those turf numbers, he's still got a little bit of work to do, would need some pace at this 5.5 furlong distance. But I could see using him in verticals in like the 3rd and 4th slots.
A horse who probably doesn't have quite as much improving to do if he gets back to his prior turf races is the number 9, Bad Beat Brian. And Craig, I guess you could say it's possible that he just didn't like the Tapeta surface at Turfway that much. He finished off the board in 3 straight starts. It's not like they were total disasters, but they weren't quite as good as his prior turf efforts at the end of last year. And he was a horse who had gotten into very good form off the claim for trainer Brittany Vandenberg. And if he can get back to the kind of form that we saw from him in September and October of last year, he could be a threat in this race at a price.
He could. You can see the difference in speed figures, the finish positions, how close he was. To me, he just looks like a horse who did not care for the synthetic turf surface at Turfway. It's not like he ran terrible, but I would suspect he's going to run better in this spot. Whether it'll be good enough to be a win contender remains to be seen.
Talk about a couple of big prices in this race that are coming out of a race from Keeneland last October. Mark of the Z and Johnny Unleashed. We'll look at the stretch run of that race, and Mark of the Z is able to run down Johnny Unleashed to get the victory going this 5.5 furlong distance. This was just an allowance race, Craig, and both of these horses have shown some class at different times in the past, but I think coming back off a layoff for Mark of the Z and also based on Johnny Unleashed's recent form, you have to wonder how they're going to stack up against this tougher field.
Yeah, I mean, they both run speed figures that are fairly competitive, maybe a little notch below. I just thought it was interesting. I wanted to show Johnny Unleashed because he's buried way back on the pace projector, and I don't think that's an accurate representation of where he's going to be. If we could eliminate just his other races that aren't on turf and look at his last starts on the turf, he's one that's probably going to be closer to the front, especially considering his inside draw.
I think that's a really good point about him. And as for Mark of the Z, whose PPs you see here, I guess remains to be seen if he can get back to the best form that he was achieving for his prior trainer. I think this is just a trainer switch with now the owner taking over training duties in his last couple of starts. So we'll see if he can start to run as well as he was towards the end of last year. And the number one, Johnny Unleashed, I think Craig was making a very valid point about him, that he's shown a lot more speed in his turf races. So maybe he's one that's going to push this pace a little bit more than that pace projector indicates. And Craig, when this horse is good, he can be pretty good. He actually was second in this race last year behind Golden Pal at 70-1.
Yeah, I actually forgot about that because it dropped off the screen, and as you were talking, it just kind of came back to my memory. He certainly can compete when he's good. It's just a question of, do you think he's off form, or do you think he just doesn't care for synthetic surfaces, or at least the one at Turfway Park?
Let's throw up our picks for this race. And Craig, I think we have some similar ideas here, trying to play around with some options that could get a little bit dismissed on the tote board if the public really does go heavily towards the number 8 Caravel. We both have Caravel fourth in our picks, but I think we're more interested in some other horses coming out of that Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint.
Yeah, I wound up going with Artemis City Limits, just a reversal of the trips from the Breeders' Cup, a reversal of post positions. I think he has good tactical speed. It's always dangerous at this 5.5. And I just think the reversal of trips can turn the tables on Caravel.
Yeah, this is a race where I just want to keep an open mind with regard to price, and I think Craig made good points about Artemis City Limits. I think Oceanic is going to be among the biggest prices of the contenders that we talked about, so I put him on top just from a value standpoint, hoping that he can show a little more of that tactical speed that we had seen from him in the past. Craig and I didn't even include the number 9 Bad Beat Brian in our picks. We had some nice things to say about him at a big price, so it's just the kind of race where I'd want to take a look at the tote board and make some value-based decisions based on that. But from a pick standpoint, it's the number 3 Artemis City Limits for Craig and the number 10 Oceanic for me in the Shakertown at Keeneland on Saturday. Good luck if you're playing the races this weekend.